Today, History 365. So today I want to step back from individual wars and kind of think big picture, maybe even big history, and that is think about the impact of climate on warfare. And of course, climate change is something that at least I personally am quite worried about, and I think you're going to see a trend of historians really trying to integrate climate into a variety of historical narratives. Now, we do have to be cautious. While clearly the environment and changes in the environment provides a backdrop to various human decisions, it constrains or expands human agency, I definitely do not think we should be climate determinists. Climate may make some options more or less likely. It may make some possibilities more or less likely for human agents on the ground. It doesn't guarantee anything. I mean, indeed, I think one lesson we should take, an immediate lesson should be, there is no reason to think that climate change necessarily makes people more or less likely to go to war, or necessarily determines the impact of any one war. Right? There's a lot of decisions that might decide a battle that have nothing to do with climate. Whether so-and-so goes around the left flank or the right flank or the center. I mean, there are many reasons why a war might start that has absolutely nothing to do with climate based on issues of politics or culture or religion. But nonetheless, climate does provide an important backdrop, particularly since for the entire course really, we're dealing with agricultural societies who are at the mercy of the weather, and whether or not it rains, whether or not the frost hits at certain points can determine the overall agricultural productivity. That will have an impact on demographics, and certainly demographics will have a significant impact on warfare. Now, in my own subfield as a Roman historian, this is actually something that we're starting to talk about. There is evidence that there is a regional warming. And I should note that this isn't global warming. This isn't a result of anthropogenic climate change. This is actually regional changes that just kind of happen naturally in the churn of global weather. But there does seem to be a warming period in Europe from around the middle of the 3rd century BC, and it may carry all the way up into the middle of the 2nd century AD. This is referred to as the Roman climate optimum by some scholars. Now, many people noted when the evidence that was published that the Europe seemed to be warmer, and they're basing this off things like evidence from tree rings, evidence from caves when stalactites get laid down. The rate of deposition can give some sense of the background temperature. So this is a reconstruction that geologists are doing. But when historians sort of became aware of this data, they said, oh my gosh, this Roman climate optimum corresponds with the period when the Roman Empire is conquering and ruling the Mediterranean sort of at its peak. And again, while I don't think that climate optimum, the fact that it seems to be more humid, it's warmer. It's not so much warmer that it causes, it seems, serious droughts, but it may be warm. It's warm enough that it's more humid. It rains more. When it rains more, crops grow better. And you could see how that could potentially have some impact on Roman success. Not the least, the Romans are reliant on infantry armies drawn from people farming relatively small plots of land. And if you're a dirt farmer, you need it to rain a lot. And if it's raining more, say starting around the middle of the 3rd century BC, all of a sudden you have dirt farmers who are doing better. The population may be growing because they can have more children. They can grow more on less land. And as they become more prosperous, they also may have more and more time which they can spend doing other things, like tromping around conquering the Mediterranean. So again, this doesn't explain necessarily the conquests of the Roman Republic or the series of individual decisions that are made in terms of when to go to war, individual tactical decisions. But it does seem that the underlying sort of environmental basis for Roman warfare up until around the 2nd century AD is favorable to people who particularly want to raise large infantry armies based on farmers. Now, it should be noted that the climate subsequently changes. That doesn't necessarily explain the fall of the Roman Empire, but it may explain why the Roman Empire seems to start having troubles by the 3rd century AD. The climate was not as favorable to agriculture, to the collection of taxes, to maintaining a robust population from which you can both have your taxpayers and your soldiers. So again, it's not like the climate changes and Rome immediately falls. We're not envisioning a kind of Game of Thrones style kind of winter is here world. But it does seem that changes in climate may make the Roman Empire less robust and less resilient, which then explains why it does eventually collapse in the 5th century AD. Now again, we are just beginning to integrate these discussions of climates, I think, onto our grand narrative of history. So what I am providing you is very much a first draft, and indeed come from my discussions with other Roman historians who are working on the problems of climate and sort of the long-term military and political fate of the Roman Empire. Let's skip ahead to the Middle Ages, though. So the years from roughly 1000 AD to around 1300 AD, so the period that includes things like the Crusades, also seems to be a very nice, warm period. This is sometimes referred to by historians as the medieval warm period. Of course, I should stress that these definitions shift, the climate science continues to evolve, the exact dating of temperatures also continues to evolve, but roughly the first 300 years or so of the 2nd millennium seems to be a darn good time climatically to live in continental Europe and beyond. The weather is warm, and again, this isn't global warming. This seems to be a regional warming, basically caused by other factors elsewhere, currents shift, winds shift, but for whatever reason, there's a several century period of warmer temperatures across what's now Europe. For example, the British are growing wine. Britain is referred to as the great place to grow wine, and French wine growers are worried about British competition. Of course, they can't grow wine in Britain today yet. But that's a sort of a sign that we have that corresponds with some other temperature data. So things are warmer. This may mean that there is, again, more moisture, crop yields may be higher, this may have demographic impacts, and indeed everything that we sort of can say about the period that medieval historians call the High Middle Ages, again from roughly 1000 to 1300, is that this is an exceptionally wealthy, prosperous, and in many instances stable time in Europe. And of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't wars. Conquest takes place. There's a period of fighting in 11th century France, but overall, this is a period when people are putting up huge cathedrals. There's a lot of evidence that this is a very wealthy society, and of course, that depends on the underlying agricultural wealth. So, if that's the case, how do we integrate that into the story of warfare? I would cautiously suggest that should perhaps form a background about thinking about a couple of aspects that we've sort of already talked about. The first is the military prominence of Scandinavia from precisely during this period. Now, I'm not saying that this explains the Viking raids, and indeed the first wave of Viking raids in the late 8th and 9th century, those all seem to happen actually before we get a lot of evidence that this robust medieval warm period is starting to take place. So things are happening in Scandinavia that might already be causing these guys to roll out in their Viking longships. But nonetheless, during this period, the Scandinavian kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, involved to be major geopolitical players. and in terms of the places that matter, they're up there on the list. I don't think this would be possible unless the world was simply warmer. That you can go grow crops in Scandinavia, you can sustain a robust enough population to make the king of Sweden or the king of Denmark or the king of Norway matter. So indeed, one way that we might explain, okay, why is there such sort of geopolitical importance of the Baltic region? Well, it's actually a little warmer up there in the Baltic region than it subsequently will be. And indeed, one thing that we will see as things start to cool is, for the most part, Sweden, Norway, Denmark cease to be as geopolitically important as, say, other places, in particular still Britain and France. Now, this also does support, while I don't think this warming necessarily explains the Vikings, it also does explain some of the Vikings, the extent that as raiders and traders and colonists, Vikings were able to go. It's very difficult to see really being able to sustain a colony on Iceland unless things are actually pretty warm and good, and especially it's impossible to think about colonizing Greenland unless things are warmer than they otherwise would be. And so the fact that we have this sort of North Atlantic diaspora that persists until really the 13th, 14th century, that is a result, I think, of warmer weather that makes places that previously would have just been too darn cold at least moderately hospitable, although the Greenland colonies are always sort of hanging by their fingernails in terms of subsistence. One other thing that I think we might want to perhaps integrate into the story is what we talked about last time, and that's the Crusades. Now, when I talked about the First Crusade, I really did try to stress that there is an element that this is cultural. You really can't explain this crusade unless you understand this is a product of Western Christian culture in the 11th century AD. And I think that's largely true. The objectives are entirely cultural, the capture of Jerusalem, even the objectives of some of the horrific religious violence those lines are determined by religious and cultural belief, not any type of desire to do a land grab. Although there is eventually some expropriation of these crusader states. So we have this huge religious phenomenon of violent men from Western Europe being able and willing to project themselves all the way into the Levant. I think, to a degree, when we look at kind of, the various levels of how we explain that, at a certain meta level, climate change and the fact that we're in a warm period must be part of that. So the Crusades, in terms of big expeditions to the Holy Land, last from 1096, and the last big one is in 1271. So all within this actually kind of warm period. And it's not like everyone says, "Oh, it's getting a little warm today. Let's go ahead and do a massive adventure to Jerusalem and kill a bunch of people." No one says that. But you need to have people who are wealthy enough to finance service in Jerusalem. Remember, in the Prince's Crusade, the First Crusade, it's largely financed by these big barons themselves. You have to come up with the money, and the supplies, and the equipment, and the shipping. Many crusaders pay part of their way themselves. That means they have to be doing well enough on their estates. We have the People's Crusade, which people are having to find a way to get themselves to Jerusalem. In some instances, they're sort of looting and pillaging their way there. But the fact that you have the human prosperity in Western Europe to underlay these massive, expensive, complex operations, I suspect has something to do with the fact that the weather is warmer, the agricultural yields have gone up, and these factors are making, for this period, Western Europe more prosperous and more successful. And that then can manifest itself on these extraordinarily ambitious military operations to the eastern Mediterranean. And then those end. And I don't think it's a total coincidence that they actually, in some instances, they end because of more robust Islamic organization that sort of repels them. But I think another reason for the end is after 1300, Western states are not in the same economic position because the climate has started to cool. This is the so-called Little Ice Age. Again, there's going to be disagreement amongst climate scientists about exactly when this happens. But there is some reason to think that Europe is suffering from environmental stresses as we enter into the 14th century. There's a huge famine from 1307 to 1314, a massive, the Great Famine that is caused by just a series of successive crop failures. And we also start seeing in the 14th and early 15th century much more unrest, low-level unrest, peasant revolts, a big peasant revolt in Flanders, a peasant revolt in England, the Wat-Taylor revolt. That there does seem to be an increased sort of low-level dissatisfaction that again may align with the fact that it's cooler. There is less. There either is weather conditions are changing. Sometimes there's too much rain. Sometimes there's not enough rain, and just crops aren't flourishing the way they used to. Grapes stopped growing in Britain, and so this cooling, on one hand, seems to bring an end of these massive, ambitious, long-range operations to the Holy Land. Again, there are other more immediate factors, but it may be that people are less wealthy to be able to undertake that kind of adventure. It's also possible, and again, we don't want to just to point towards climate change as causing any one war, or even necessarily increasing the frequency of warfare. But it is possible that this is why we do start to see at times a more intensive period of warfare between European powers. That is, the sort of zero-sum game starts to set in. There may be, at certain times, reasons to go to war in order to obtain territory, resources, human resources and population. So it's not impossible that as we enter this period of extremely intensive interstate warfare in Europe, that some of that is undergirded, again, by the limitations of what in this instance we might actually call regional climate, regional cooling. It's not global cooling. Again, this is a regional phenomenon, but this may create a sort of shortage, a sense of shortage that explains why we do see a sort of, at least in this period, an intensification in warfare. All right, so those are just some thoughts. What we'll do on Wednesday is we will talk about one of the sort of greatest manifestations of this violent period, and that is the 100 Years' War between France and England. See you then.